Welcome to our study of Santa Sabina, our first Christian church. Let me set my timer here. I try and keep it to 8 minutes. Okay. I'm mentioning the Edict of Milan. If you've been through WAP, you already know about the Edict of Milan. Essentially, it brought religious tolerance to the Roman Empire. Mostly it's directed then towards Christianity, right? Because Christians had been under persecution for quite a long time. Although, they're obviously gaining more and more converts, which is probably part of the reason why the edict was proclaimed. Constantine is our first Christian emperor. He's understood to have converted to Christianity. If you go to the Vatican at St. Peter's, you can see before you walk into the doors, I think it's on the right, you'll see a big, gigantic statue of Constantine in his conversion process. Anywho, so this is a big deal because now Christianity is out in the open and obviously is going to become the dominant force in Western history for a long, long time. Okay. So we have Santa Sabina. You'll notice if we look at the outside, it looks kind of plain, right? Early Christian churches were plain on the outside. They were plain on the outside and kind of fancy not fancy, but more decorated, more emphasis on the interior. That makes sense, right? We're not interested in this world. We're interested in the spiritual world, right? So it's not about the body. It's about the spirit. So that's definitely the thrust of early Christianity. The interior does not look like it used to originally. The basic layout is the same, but it looks very different. I'll talk about what is the same and what's different in just a few moments. But we'll want to note that this is a basilica. This is a basilica. It is called a basilica planned church. So what is a basilica? Well, we're already familiar with basilicas because we saw the Basilica Ulpia from Trajan's Forum. I mentioned that the shape of basilicas would later be used by Christians when they're making their churches. Why is this important? Because you want to make a building that reminds the people of the previous power. Right? You want to put it in the shape of that's suggestive of the previous authority, right? So we have a church now that is in the is in the shape of a Roman basilica, except for the fact it only has one apse, that semicircular end, right? There are not two apses. Why is there only one apse? Because there's only one altar. And the altar is where the Eucharist, where we have transubstantiation take place, et cetera, et cetera. If you've been through WAP, you know. But this is our main focus, is what's happening on the altar, right? And so it makes sense that this church is oriented this way, so we can see that everything is moving towards the altar, right? So let's talk a little bit about vocabulary. Our central space is the nave, right? We have columns here. We have the aisle here, and we have the aisle here. But let's go back and look at this, right? So here's where the aisles are, down here, right? And they're here in this part in this picture, right? But then we have this higher wall, and on this higher wall are windows. What is that called? A clerestory, right? Oh, where have I heard clerestory before? The Temple of Amun-Ra. Okay, so the clerestory and the clerestory windows remain super duper important. Okay, so aisle, column. Actually, this is an arcade. I'll talk about the difference in a second. The arcade, the rows of columns. We have the nave. We have the apse. Only one apse. Okay. So another thing that we need to note about this church, which is located in Italy, Rome, right, is who Santa Sabina is. Saint Sabina. She was a Roman noblewoman, wife of a senator. She was martyred because she was a Christian. Long story, not important. Well, she was martyred because she was a Christian, right? And so later on, they built this church in honor of her. And the location of this church is very close to where a temple to Juno once was. Juno is, Hera, the wife of Zeus, right? Well, why put a Christian church close to where a Roman pagan church was? It makes sense, right? Because you want to go to the same kind of location where you associate religious worship with, Okay, so it's not exactly syncretism because we're not taking a symbol, but it's very similar to the syncretic idea that I mentioned during the Priscilla catacombs. Okay, so Basilica plan. And here, of course, is the Basilica Ulpia plan. They have a double colonnade, right? 2 rows of columns, whereas Santa Sabina only has 1. Okay, so the doors are of note. They're going to talk about the doors in the video. We do have some of the same the wood paneled doors. Part of them remain. This is a big deal that wood has lasted this long, that it hasn't burnt down or disintegrated or whatever. So we can see images from I'm pretty sure it's mostly, I think it's both Old and New Testament. Obviously, this is going to be a crucifixion image. We don't see Christ up on a cross. No, I don't see a cross here, but I do see a pediment. Anyway, all right. So the interior of Santa Sabina. So this is obviously the nave, right? The large central space. There's the aisle. There's the aisle. There's the apse. Here's the clerestory with the clerestory windows. Okay. The rows of columns in this case is not called a colonnade. It's called an arcade. And the reason why it's called an arcade is because there are arches, right? Arches, A-C-R, right? So if it were straight, right, it would be a colonnade. This is an arcade. All right. We see these are Corinthian columns. Oh, wow. The Christians are using Corinthian columns. Yes, they are. These are actually spolia. They are spolia. What is spolia? Spolia is using an object from an old building in a new building, right? So these were taken from a different, older Roman building, okay? And they were used in this building. This happens all the time. So using parts from usually just decorative parts mostly, but these are obviously decorative and functional because they're helping hold up the arcade. From older spaces in the newer spaces. Okay, spolia. All right, that's a term you definitely need to know. So we see a nod back to even the Greeks there, right? So the Greeks don't go away. Guys, if you don't understand the Greeks, you don't understand the Romans. If you don't understand the Romans, you don't understand anything about the West, okay? You've got to get the Greeks and Romans down. It's so critical. So critical. Okay. All right. So another thing is that, so I see here that I see some decorations on the arcade. I'll talk about the different kinds. So the space between the arches those are called spandrels. So it's kind of triangular looking space between the arches. And if we notice on the spandrels here, okay, I've hit 8 minutes, so I'm going to shut up in just a second. We notice on the spandrels here, we see mosaics. These are mosaics made of smaller pieces of stone of the Eucharistic cup and paten, which is the kind of the plate. Okay, so references to the Eucharist here, which is the body and blood of Christ. So these walls seem very plain, used to be totally covered in mosaics. And glittery, beautiful mosaics where, of course, the light comes in and hits the light on the mosaics, et cetera, quite beautiful. When as churches, as buildings go through time and different periods and different powers that be, they get changed. And so at some point the mosaics came down and something like this, which is, oh gosh, I'm going to say that is from the early 1600s. Something like this would go up. This is not original. This was added later, right? So because buildings change throughout time. So I've talked about spandrels. I've talked about arcades. I would recommend for a really solid understanding that you go to this article. I will link it on Khan Academy that talks about Santa Sabina in particular. I'll probably hit it in class, but one more thing. So it's a basilica plan church, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is that you understand that it is a basilica plan Church. Okay. Thank you very much.